When a renowned black doctor brings her outreach clinic to a struggling small town, her mission to provide critical healthcare is met with shocking resistance from a corrupt and racist sheriff. Using his authority to harass, intimidate, and obstruct her efforts, the sheriff detains medical equipment, humiliates her in public, and ultimately has her unjustly arrested. The story delves into the infuriating realities of racism in America, exposing the systemic abuse of power designed to silence and oppress. As tensions rise, the battle becomes about more than medicine. It's a fight for justice and accountability in a deeply broken system. Dr. Elena Grayson adjusted her glasses as she scanned the menu at Tilly's Diner, a quaint, slightly worn spot nestled on the edge of a town that seemed forgotten by time. The smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee filled the air, a comforting aroma that reminded her of simpler times. Despite her carefully curated public image as one of the nation's most accomplished neurosurgeons, she found peace in spaces like this, a far cry from the glitzy fundraisers and medical conferences where she was often the center of attention. Elena, at 41, was an enigma to many who knew her only by reputation. She had shattered every glass ceiling in her field, overseeing groundbreaking procedures and running the neurology department at a prestigious hospital. Her name graced the covers of medical journals and invitations to events that dripped with exclusivity. But here, in this diner with its cracked vinyl booths and faded photographs on the walls, she could just be Elena. No title, no accolades, no weight of expectation. As she sat alone at a corner table, dressed casually in jeans and a loose cardigan, she drew no second glances. Her skin, a deep, glowing brown, radiated health and vitality. Her natural curls framed a face that was warm and unassuming. To the waitress who placed a chipped ceramic mug of coffee before her, she was just another diner patron, and that's exactly how Elena liked it. The town of Silver Ridge had seen better days. Once a bustling hub for local industry, its streets now bore the scars of economic decline, boarded-up storefronts, faded for sale signs, and a handful of locals clinging to traditions that no longer paid the bills. The diner was a relic of its more prosperous past, frequented by truckers, retirees, and the occasional passerby. Elena had come here not for nostalgia, but for necessity. Her clinic's mobile outreach program, which brought neurological care to underserved areas, was visiting the county hospital this week. It was her initiative, a personal mission born of her own experiences, growing up in a working-class neighborhood where access to quality healthcare had been a distant dream. Silver Ridge was exactly the kind of place Elena wanted to help. Yet, as she glanced around the diner, she could feel the subtle weight of being an outsider. A wealthy, educated black woman in a town where her presence was an anomaly. She knew the whispers would start soon enough, if they hadn't already. They always did. "More coffee, hon?" the waitress asked, her voice tinged with a polite indifference. Elena smiled up at her. "Yes, please, and the waffles, with a side of bacon." The waitress nodded, scribbling on her pad, but her gaze lingered just a second too long. Curious, maybe even suspicious. Elena was used to it. People often struggled to reconcile her unassuming demeanor with the quiet power she radiated. She had learned to navigate these moments with grace, letting the dissonance resolve itself in their minds without explanation. Across the room, a man in a sheriff's uniform sat at the counter, his boots scuffed from years on the job. He was a stocky figure with graying hair, sipping his coffee as he eyed her from over the rim of his mug. Elena caught his glance but didn't hold it, her attention returning to the view outside the window. Still, she felt his gaze linger like a low hum in the background. The morning light spilled through the blinds, illuminating the worn linoleum floor. Elena's phone buzzed softly on the table beside her coffee. She glanced at the screen. It was Dr. Kim, her second-in-command at the hospital, likely calling about the outreach program logistics. Elena let it go to voicemail, determined to steal a moment of peace before diving back into the world that demanded so much of her. She didn't get far. The diner door jingled as two young men entered, their laughter too loud for the otherwise quiet space. They were dressed in the way that broadcast wealth to those who knew how to read it. Expensive sneakers, logoed hoodies, and gold chains that caught the morning sun. Tourists, Elena guessed. Or maybe weekenders with second homes in the nearby hills. The sheriff straightened slightly on his stool, his hand brushing the radio at his hip. His eyes flicked between the newcomers and Elena, suspicion etched into his features. Elena watched the interaction play out in the reflection of the diner's window, her practiced calm betraying none of the unease stirring within her. The waitress returned with Elena's order, placing the plate of waffles and bacon before her with a practiced smile. "Enjoy, hon," she said, her tone softer this time. Maybe it was Elena's polite demeanor, or the generous tip she'd left for the coffee earlier. Either way, the subtle shift in warmth was not lost on her. Elena had just picked up her fork when the sheriff rose from his stool. He didn't say anything to the waitress or the cook behind the counter. Instead, he moved toward the two young men, his boots heavy against the floor. The tension in the room thickened as he stopped just short of them. "You boys from around here?" the sheriff asked, his voice casual but with an edge that was hard to miss. The taller of the two men glanced at his friend before answering. "Nah, just passing through," he said, his smile easy but guarded. "Passing through, huh?" the sheriff said, folding his arms across his chest. "Funny place to stop for breakfast." Elena's fork paused midway to her mouth. She had seen this scene play out before. Not here, not with these people, but in countless other places. The easy display of authority, the subtle undertone of suspicion, the assumption that the boys were out of place. It was a story as old as the diner itself. The shorter of the two men raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his tone neutral but firm. The sheriff smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not yet," he said. "Just making sure everything's in order." Elena set her fork down, her appetite suddenly gone. She knew she should stay out of it. She was here to work, not to make waves. But something about the scene unfolding before her, something about the boys' defiance in the face of thinly veiled hostility, struck a chord she couldn't ignore. Clearing her throat, Elena turned slightly in her seat. "Sheriff," she said, her voice calm and steady, "I think the boys were just about to order breakfast." The room seemed to still as all eyes turned toward her. The sheriff blinked, his posture stiffening slightly as he shifted his gaze to her. He didn't speak immediately, as if weighing whether or not to respond. "And you are?" he asked finally, his tone clipped. Elena smiled, the warmth never reaching her eyes. "Just someone who likes to see a good meal served without unnecessary interruptions." The taller of the two men shot her a look of gratitude, but the sheriff's expression darkened. "Well, ma'am," he said, drawing out the word as if it were an insult, "I'm just doing my job." "And I'm sure you're very good at it," Elena replied, her tone smooth as silk. "But I think your coffee's getting cold." For a moment, the tension felt almost unbearable. Then, slowly, the sheriff stepped back, his gaze lingering on Elena, as if memorizing her face. Without another word, he returned to the counter, his boots heavy with each step. Elena exhaled quietly, her hand returning to her fork. The two young men glanced at each other, then back at her, their expressions a mix of relief and curiosity. She gave them a small nod, before turning her attention back to her meal. Outside the window, the town of Silver Ridge continued to wake, its streets bathed in the soft light of the morning sun, but inside the diner, something had shifted. A crack in the veneer, a subtle reminder that power, authority, and justice were not always aligned. Elena had no illusions about the day ahead. The outreach program would bring its own challenges, and her presence in this town would continue to draw stares and whispers. But for now, she was content to have played her part in tilting the scales, if only slightly, toward fairness. The clatter of Elena's fork against her plate drew no attention as she pushed her breakfast aside. She felt the sheriff's lingering gaze burning into the back of her neck, a silent challenge, as though he were daring her to step further into his domain. The diner's air had turned stifling, the tension from the earlier exchange still thick and pervasive. The two young men had settled into a booth near the window. Their voices were low, their postures guarded, but their eyes darted nervously around the room. Elena had seen this look before, the careful vigilance of black men who had learned that even casual encounters could spiral into danger without warning. Her phone buzzed again on the table, breaking her train of thought. She glanced at the screen. Another call from Dr. Kim. Reluctantly, she answered, holding the phone close to her ear to muffle the conversation. "Morning, Kim," she said softly, trying to maintain an air of calm. "What's the update?" Dr. Kim's voice crackled on the other end. Elena, we've got a delay at the county hospital. Apparently, our equipment truck was rerouted by local authorities for an inspection. I've been on the phone all morning trying to sort it out. Elena closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. In her years of running the outreach program, she had learned that bureaucracy could be wielded as a weapon, especially in communities where her work wasn't always welcomed. "Who's handling the inspection?" Elena asked, her voice steady, despite the frustration building in her chest. "Sheriff's Department," Kim replied. "And they're not exactly being cooperative. I think they're stalling." Elena's gaze flicked toward the sheriff, who was now nursing his coffee at the counter. His body language exuded authority, a man who relished his role as the town's gatekeeper. She knew this wasn't a coincidence. "I'll handle it," Elena said, her tone firm. "Send me the contact information for whoever's in charge." After settling her bill, Elena left the diner, the sheriff's eyes following her all the way to the door. She felt his gaze as she stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk, her heels clicking against the uneven pavement. The morning sun did little to warm her mood. Her car, a sleek black SUV, was parked across the street. It stood out against the rusted pickups and older sedans that filled the lot, a symbol of her success that, in this town, seemed more like a target. As she unlocked the door, she noticed the sheriff had stepped outside, leaning casually against the diner's doorway. He was watching her, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Elena refused to let him rattle her. She climbed into the driver's seat and pulled up the email Dr. Kim had just sent. The contact for the inspection. Lieutenant Warren, the sheriff's second-in-command. She dialed the number and waited as the phone rang. "Lieutenant Warren speaking," came a gruff voice on the other end. "Good morning, Lieutenant," Elena began, her voice measured and professional. "This is Dr. Elena Grayson with the Grayson Neurological Outreach Program. I understand that one of our trucks is being held for inspection under your department's authority." A pause. Then, "Yes, ma'am, that's correct. Routine inspection shouldn't take long." "Routine," Elena repeated, her tone carefully neutral. "I wasn't aware that medical equipment fell under such scrutiny. Our schedule is tight, and any delays could impact patient care. May I ask why this inspection is necessary?" There was another pause, longer this time. "Just following protocol, Dr. Grayson," Warren said finally. "We can't be too careful these days." Elena clenched her jaw. She had heard this line before, a thinly veiled excuse to assert authority, to remind her that she wasn't in control here. She forced herself to keep her voice calm. "I understand the need for safety, Lieutenant," she said, "but our equipment is critical for today's outreach. If there's any issue, I'd appreciate it if you could expedite the process." "I'll see what I can do," Warren replied, his tone dismissive. "But I can't make any promises." The call ended before Elena could respond. She stared at her phone, her fingers gripping it tightly. This wasn't just about the truck, it was about control, about putting her in her place. She had faced obstacles like this before, but it never got easier. Elena drove to the county hospital, her hands gripping the wheel tightly as she navigated the narrow streets. When she arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few cars and a police cruiser stationed near the entrance. The truck was parked on the far side of the lot, a uniformed officer standing beside it with his arms crossed. As Elena approached, the officer straightened, his expression unreadable. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, but there was a hardened edge to his demeanor that made him seem older. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone clipped. "I'm Dr. Grayson," she said, extending her hand. "I'm here to check on the status of this inspection." The officer didn't take her hand. Instead, he glanced at the truck, then back at her. "You'll need to wait for the lieutenant, he's handling it." Elena lowered her hand slowly, her patience fraying. "Is he on his way?" The officer shrugged. "Shouldn't be long." Elena nodded, stepping back to lean against her SUV. She crossed her arms, forcing herself to breathe evenly. This wasn't the first time she'd been stonewalled, but the sheer pettiness of it still grated on her. They weren't just delaying the inspection, they were delaying care for patients who desperately needed it. Minutes turned into half an hour, and there was still no sign of Warren. Elena checked her watch, then approached the officer again. "Is there a reason this process is taking so long?" she asked, her tone firm. The officer didn't meet her gaze. Like I said, you'll need to wait for the lieutenant. Elena opened her mouth to respond, but a voice behind her cut her off. Is there a problem here? She turned to see Lieutenant Warren approaching, his stride confident and his expression unreadable. He was a tall man with a weathered face, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. His gaze flicked over her briefly, before settling on the truck. Lieutenant Warren, Elena said, stepping forward. Thank you for coming. I'd like to understand why our truck has been detained. Warren smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just routine, Dr. Grayson. We've had reports of unusual activity in the area, and we're being thorough. Unusual activity, Elena repeated, her brow furrowing. This is medical equipment, Lieutenant. There's nothing unusual about it. Warren shrugged. Can't be too careful these days. Elena's composure faltered for a split second. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. But she knew better than to let it show. She took a deep breath and forced a smile. I appreciate your caution, she said, her voice steady. But I have patients waiting for this equipment. If there's no valid reason for the delay, I'd like to have the truck released immediately. Warren's smile faded, replaced by a faint smirk. I'll see what I can do, he said, turning to the officer. Go ahead and wrap this up. The officer nodded and moved toward the truck, but Warren lingered, his eyes locked on Elena. You know, he said, his tone conversational, you've got a lot of nerve, coming into this town and telling us how to do our jobs. Elena met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. I'm here to help your community, Lieutenant. That's all. Warren chuckled, shaking his head. Help, huh? Funny how people like you always think they know what's best. Elena's hands clenched at her sides, but she didn't take the bait. Instead, she turned and walked away, her strides purposeful. She could feel Warren's eyes on her as she climbed back into her SUV, but she refused to look back. Inside the car, Elena gripped the steering wheel tightly, her breaths coming fast and shallow. She wanted to scream, to rail against the injustice of it all, but she knew it would accomplish nothing. Instead, she sat in silence, her mind racing. This wasn't just about a truck or a sheriff's department, it was about a system that saw her not as a doctor or a leader, but as a threat. It was about the unspoken rules that dictated who was welcome and who wasn't. As the truck finally pulled out of the lot, its release secured, Elena started the engine. She wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Elena's SUV hummed softly as she pulled into the hospital's gravel lot, her mind still simmering from the encounter with Lieutenant Warren. The truck was finally here, but the cost of that victory weighed heavily. Every interaction, every delay, was another calculated blow to remind her that power in this town didn't belong to her. Inside the makeshift clinic, the scene was chaotic. Nurses bustled about, unpacking supplies while patients crowded into the waiting area, clutching forms and murmuring anxiously. Dr. Kim spotted Elena from across the room and hurried over, his face etched with worry. They held us up for over an hour, he said in a low voice, pulling her aside. We're behind schedule, and there's more trouble. What now? Elena asked, exhaustion creeping into her voice. Kim hesitated, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. There's a county health inspector here. He's going through our supplies, saying some of them don't meet regulations. I think it's another stall tactic. Elena's jaw tightened. She had worked tirelessly to ensure every detail of this program met and exceeded legal standards. These inspections weren't about safety, they were about obstruction. Where is he? She asked, her tone steely. Kim nodded toward the far end of the room, where a middle-aged man in a gray suit stood beside a stack of crates, clipboard in hand. His posture was officious, his gaze darting suspiciously over every label and document. Elena squared her shoulders and approached him, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Excuse me, she said, her voice firm but polite. I'm Dr. Grayson, the director of this program. Can I help you? The inspector looked up, his expression guarded. Dr. Grayson, I'm reviewing your supplies for compliance with state and federal regulations. Everything here has already been cleared by our legal and medical teams, Elena replied. I'd be happy to provide you with documentation. The inspector hesitated, then gestured toward a stack of boxes labeled Neurological Diagnostic Kits. These kits are outdated, they don't meet the current standards for medical use. Elena's brow furrowed. That's impossible. These kits were purchased less than 6 months ago and certified for use in underserved communities. If there's an issue, it's not with the equipment, it's with your information. The inspector bristled at her tone, standing straighter. I'm simply doing my job, doctor. If you'd prefer, we can escalate this to the state board. Elena recognized the threat for what it was, a power play meant to intimidate her into compliance, but she also knew that engaging further would only draw out the conflict, and the patients in the waiting area couldn't afford more delays. We'll resolve this, she said evenly. But in the meantime, these patients need care. Let's not make them suffer because of a clerical issue. The inspector opened his mouth to argue, but a sharp voice interrupted. What's going on here? Elena turned to see Mitchell, the hospital's administrator, striding toward them. His presence carried authority, but his demeanor was often as slippery as his neatly combed hair. He was a man who thrived on keeping everyone slightly off balance, playing both sides of every conflict. Mitchell, Elena said, her tone a mix of relief and caution. I was just discussing an inspection issue with your health inspector. Mitchell glanced between them, his sharp eyes narrowing. Dr. Grayson is a respected leader in her field, he said to the inspector, his voice laced with subtle warning. I trust her judgment. If she says the equipment is compliant, that's good enough for me. The inspector hesitated, clearly caught off guard. After a long moment, he nodded stiffly. I'll file my report then. Mitchell smiled thinly. You do that? As the inspector walked away, Elena let out a slow breath. Thank you, she said, her gratitude genuine but measured. Mitchell shrugged, his expression unreadable. I don't like disruptions in my hospital. Let's leave it at that. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Patients filed through the clinic, their stories a mix of heartbreak and resilience. A farmer who had ignored migraines for years because he couldn't afford treatment. A teenage girl whose epilepsy had gone undiagnosed, an elderly woman with early signs of dementia. Elena worked tirelessly, her focus on each individual reminding her why she had started this program in the first place. But even as she helped, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was subtle at first. A lingering gaze, a whisper that cut off when she entered a room. By the time the clinic closed for the day, the tension had coiled so tightly in her chest that she could hardly breathe. As she packed up her belongings, Dr. Kim approached, his face pale. Elena, he said quietly, there's something you need to see. He handed her his phone, where a video was playing. The grainy footage showed the diner from earlier that morning, with Elena confronting the sheriff. The sound was muffled, but the words were clear enough. Just someone who likes to see a good meal, served without unnecessary interruptions. The caption beneath the video read, Entitled outsider tries to tell local law enforcement how to do their job. Elena's stomach sank as she scrolled through the comments. They ranged from ignorant mockery to outright vitriol. Some even included threats. Where did this come from? She asked, her voice tight. It's everywhere, Kim said. Someone must have recorded it and sent it to a local news outlet. The sheriff's department is using it to stir people up. Elena felt the weight of the day crash down on her. She had worked so hard to build trust in these communities, to prove that her program was about helping, not imposing. But now, she was being painted as an interloper, a threat to the fragile balance of power. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Carter, her lawyer and longtime friend. Saw the video, call me ASAP. As night fell, Elena sat alone in her SUV, parked in the lot of a nearby motel. She stared at the phone in her hand. Carter's number already dialed. The moment he answered, his voice was clipped and serious. I assume you've seen the video, he said. I have, Elena replied. What do I do? You need to get ahead of this, Carter said. The sheriff's department is clearly using this to undermine you. If you let their narrative stand, it'll poison the entire program. And if I push back? Elena asked. Carter hesitated. It'll escalate, they'll dig deeper, find anything they can use against you. Elena closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She could stay silent, let the storm pass, and hope her work would speak for itself, or she could fight back, knowing full well the risks. I won't let them intimidate me, she said finally, her voice firm. Not when lives are at stake. Carter sighed. Then we need to act fast. I'll draft a statement, but you'll need to make a public appearance, show them who you are and what you stand for. The next morning, Elena stood outside the clinic, flanked by her staff and a small group of patients who had agreed to speak on her behalf. Reporters crowded around, cameras flashing as she stepped up to the microphone. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. "My name is Dr. Elena Grayson. I'm here today to address the recent attempts to discredit me and the work of this program." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. This program exists to provide critical care to communities that have been overlooked and underserved for far too long. The patients we see here are not statistics. They are mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, people who deserve the same level of care as anyone else. The crowd murmured, the tension palpable. "I won't be intimidated by those who seek to undermine this work," she continued, her voice rising. "The tactics we've seen over the past 2 days, delays, inspections, and now this smear campaign, are not about public safety. They are about fear. Fear of change. Fear of accountability. Fear of equality." The reporters leaned in, their cameras capturing every word. "And to those who think they can silence me," she concluded, her gaze steady, "I have only one thing to say. I'm just getting started." As she stepped back from the microphone, the applause from her supporters was drowned out by the roar of approaching sirens. 3 squad cars pulled into the lot, their lights flashing. Elena's heart pounded as the sheriff stepped out, flanked by Warren and 2 other deputies. "Dr. Grayson," the sheriff called, his voice booming, "we need to have a word." Elena squared her shoulders, ready for whatever came next. The sheriff's boots hit the asphalt with deliberate weight as he approached the small crowd gathered outside the clinic. His deputies followed close behind, their faces a mix of forced stoicism and thinly veiled disdain. The flashing blue and red lights of their squad cars cast harsh shadows across the scene, turning the clinic's welcoming facade into a stark backdrop for what was about to unfold. Dr. Elena Grayson stood firm at the front of the group, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to steady the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Behind her, her staff exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to retreat or hold their ground. The patients who had spoken on her behalf moments ago were now frozen in place, their courage fading under the weight of authority's gaze. The sheriff stopped a few feet away, his hands resting on his belt in a posture that was more intimidating than casual. His smirk from the diner was gone, replaced by a hardened expression that made it clear this wasn't a conversation, it was a confrontation. "Dr. Grayson," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd, "we have reason to believe you're in violation of several local ordinances." Elena tilted her head slightly, her tone calm despite the tightening in her chest. "I wasn't aware that providing medical care to underserved communities was against the law, Sheriff." His eyes narrowed. "Don't play coy with me. Doctor, your mobile unit's permits are incomplete, your equipment's not properly certified, and—" he glanced pointedly at the crowd. "You've been causing a disturbance in our town." The weight of his words hung in the air, a thinly veiled threat that sent a ripple of unease through the onlookers. Elena's mind raced, weighing her options. She knew the permits were in order. She'd triple-checked them herself. This wasn't about legality. It was about power. The sheriff wanted to make an example of her, to send a message that no one, not even someone of her stature, was above his authority. But Elena wasn't about to back down. She squared her shoulders and met his gaze head-on. "If there's an issue with our permits, I'd be happy to review them with you, but I can assure you, everything we're doing here is in full compliance with state and federal law." The sheriff's lip twitched, a flicker of irritation at her refusal to cower. He stepped closer, his voice dropping into a lower, more menacing register. "I don't think you understand, Doctor. This isn't a negotiation." Behind Elena, Dr. Kim stepped forward, his voice shaking slightly as he tried to intervene. "Sheriff, if I may—" The sheriff's hand shot up, cutting him off. "I'm not talking to you," he snapped, his gaze never leaving Elena. Elena reached back subtly, placing a calming hand on Kim's arm. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice steady. She turned her attention back to the sheriff. "Let's not escalate this, Sheriff. We're all here to help the people of your town. Surely that's something we can agree on." The sheriff chuckled, a low, humorless sound. Helping people, huh? Is that what you call it when outsiders roll in, stir up trouble, and then leave us to clean up the mess? I think we both know this isn't about a mess, Elena replied, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. This is about control. But I'm not here to challenge you. I'm here to do my job. The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Elena's composure. But the sheriff's face darkened, his frustration evident. He looked over his shoulder at one of his deputies, a younger man with a nervous energy that betrayed his discomfort. "Daniels!" the sheriff barked. "Arrest her!" The words hit like a gunshot. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as Deputy Daniels hesitated, his hand hovering near the cuffs on his belt. "Sir, are you sure?" Daniels began, his voice faltering. "You heard me," the sheriff growled. "She's obstructing justice." Elena's heart pounded, but her expression didn't waver. She could feel the tension radiating from her staff and supporters behind her, their outrage simmering just below the surface. "Sheriff," she said, her tone even, "arresting me won't change the fact that this town needs help. It won't silence the voices of the people here who deserve better. It will only prove that you're more interested in intimidation than progress." For a moment, the sheriff's resolve seemed to falter. But his ego wouldn't allow him to back down now, not in front of an audience. He gestured sharply at Daniels, who stepped forward reluctantly. As Daniels reached for her wrist, Elena raised her hands in a gesture of surrender, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "To everyone here," she said, "remember what this feels like. Remember that the fight for justice doesn't stop because of moments like this. It starts here." Her words landed like a rallying cry, and the crowd began to shift. Patients and staff alike moved closer, their outrage spilling into shouts of protest. The sheriff turned, barking orders to his deputies to control the growing chaos. As the cuffs clicked around her wrists, Elena felt a surge of anger and resolve course through her. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. She glanced over her shoulder at Dr. Kim, who was furiously typing into his phone. "Call Carter," she said quietly, knowing he would understand. Kim nodded, his jaw set in determination. "We've got your back," he promised. The squad car's interior was cold and sterile, the hum of the engine drowning out the noise from the crowd as they pulled away. Elena sat in silence, her hands resting on her lap, the cuffs digging into her wrists. The sheriff sat in the front seat, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "You think you're some kind of hero," he said, his tone mocking. Elena met his gaze in the mirror, her eyes unflinching. "No," she said simply. "I think I'm doing what's right." The sheriff snorted, but he didn't respond. When they arrived at the station, Elena was led into a small holding cell, the stark fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the concrete walls. The cuffs were removed, and the door clanged shut behind her, the sound echoing through the empty room. Alone, Elena allowed herself a moment to breathe. Her mind raced, not with fear, but with strategy. This wasn't just an attack on her. It was an attack on everything she stood for. And she would use it to shine a light on the corruption that had been hiding in the shadows for far too long. Meanwhile, back at the clinic, the crowd had only grown. News of Elena's arrest had spread like wildfire, drawing reporters and supporters from across the county. Mitchell, the hospital administrator, stood on the clinic steps, his expression unreadable as he watched the scene unfold. Dr. Kim approached him, his phone still in hand. "We need to do something," he said urgently. "We can't let them get away with this." Mitchell hesitated, his calculating mind weighing the risks. "This is bigger than the clinic," he said finally. "If we're going to take a stand, we need to make it count." Back at the station, Carter arrived in record time, his presence as sharp and commanding as ever. He walked into the precinct with a confidence that immediately drew attention, his tailored suit and briefcase a stark contrast to the utilitarian surroundings. "I'm here for Dr. Grayson," he announced to the desk officer, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officer glanced nervously at the sheriff, who had appeared in the doorway. Their eyes met in a silent battle of wills before the sheriff gestured for Carter to follow him. Inside the holding cell, Elena stood as Carter entered, her resolve bolstered by the sight of him. "Took you long enough," she said, her attempt at humor masking the tension in her voice. Carter's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You know I like to make an entrance." The sheriff stood nearby, his arms crossed as he glared at them. "You're not taking her anywhere," he said. "She's being held for obstruction." "Obstruction of what?" Carter shot back. "Providing medical care? Advocating for underserved communities? Or is it just because she stood up to you?" The sheriff's face reddened, but he didn't respond. Carter turned to Elena, his expression serious. "We're going to fight this," he said. "And we're going to win." Elena nodded, her determination unwavering. "Let's make it count." The air inside the precinct's interrogation room was thick with tension. Elena sat at the metal table, her hands resting calmly on the cold surface, though her heart hammered in her chest. Across from her sat Sheriff Daniels, his posture aggressive, leaning forward as though his proximity could somehow intimidate her. His badge caught the fluorescent light, gleaming like a symbol of unchecked authority. Beside Elena, Carter sat with a notebook open, his pen poised but unmoving. His silence was deliberate, a quiet show of force that unnerved even the most seasoned opponents. He had briefed Elena on how to handle this, but the final strategy was hers to choose. Sheriff Daniels flipped through a file in front of him, his jaw tight as he feigned interest in the papers. The charade was for show. Elena could feel his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You've caused quite a stir, Dr. Grayson," he said finally, not looking up. "Social media's lit up with your little stunt back at the clinic." "If ensuring people receive medical care is a stunt," Elena replied, her tone steady, "then I suppose I'm guilty." Daniels's eyes flicked to hers, narrowing. "You think you're clever coming into my town, stirring up trouble, making me look bad." "This isn't about you," she said evenly. "It's about the people you're supposed to serve, people who need care but are being denied it because of bureaucratic roadblocks." He slammed the file shut, the sound reverberating through the small room. "Don't lecture me on serving this town. I've been keeping this community in line for over 20 years. Carter spoke for the first time, his voice cutting through Daniel's bluster like a blade. "Keeping them in line or keeping them under your thumb?" Daniels whipped his head toward Carter, his face darkening. "Watch yourself, counselor. I don't have to let you sit in on this." "Oh, but you do," Carter said smoothly. "My client hasn't been charged with anything, and until she is, you have no grounds to detain her. Or am I mistaken about how the law works in your town?" Daniel's face twitched, the barely concealed contempt surfacing for just a moment before he masked it again. "The law works just fine here," he growled. "But sometimes people like her think they're above it." Elena felt the weight of his words, the veiled implication that her race and success were threats to the order Daniels believed he maintained. She had faced this kind of bias her entire life, thinly veiled hatred wrapped in the guise of authority. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't alone, and she wasn't going to let it stand. "Sheriff," she said, leaning forward slightly, "what exactly do you think you're accomplishing here? Arresting me for obstruction? Humiliating me in front of the community I'm trying to help? Or are you just trying to remind me that you're in charge?" Daniels bristled, his hands balling into fists on the table. "I don't need to remind anyone I am in charge." "Not for long," Carter said quietly, flipping open his notebook. "Because once the video of you abusing your authority hits the national news, I imagine the state investigators will take a very different view." Daniel's jaw clenched so tightly that Elena wondered if it might snap. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the hum of the overhead lights. Then the door opened. Lieutenant Warren stepped inside, his face carefully neutral. He nodded at Daniels before glancing at Elena and Carter. "Sheriff, can I have a word?" Daniels' face flushed, but he rose, throwing a glare at Elena before following Warren into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind them, muffling their voices. Carter turned to Elena, his expression grim but steady. "This is a power play," he said. "He wants you to back down, make a mistake, anything he can use against you." Elena nodded. "I know, but what's his endgame? This isn't just about me." "It's about control," Carter said, "and we're threatening it." Outside the room, the muffled conversation between Daniels and Warren grew louder. The sheriff's voice rose, and a moment later, the door burst open. Daniels stormed back in, his face a mask of fury, with Warren trailing behind him. "I've had enough of this," Daniels snapped. You think you can waltz in here with your high-priced lawyer and make demands not in my town? Elena stood slowly, her composure unshaken. Sheriff, if you're so confident in your position, why are you so afraid of scrutiny? Daniel stepped closer, his face inches from hers. You don't belong here, he hissed. You're just another outsider trying to tell us how to live, but you don't know this town, and you sure as hell don't know me. Maybe I don't, Elena said calmly, but I know corruption when I see it. Daniels froze, his eyes narrowing. Watch your mouth. Or what? Carter interjected, stepping between them. You'll arrest her again. Go ahead, Sheriff, give us another headline. Daniels's gaze flicked between them, calculating his next move. But before he could speak, Warren cleared his throat. Sheriff, he said, his tone hesitant. There's something you need to see. What now? Daniels barked. Warren held up his phone, his expression grim. It's about Green. At the mention of the name, Daniels stiffened. Warren stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Daniels could hear. Whatever he said, it hit the sheriff like a gut punch. His face paled, and for the first time, he looked genuinely shaken. Elena exchanged a glance with Carter, who arched an eyebrow. Something was unraveling, and they needed to seize the moment. What's wrong, Sheriff? Elena asked, her voice cutting through the tension. Something you don't want us to know? Daniels turned to her, his bravado faltering. This isn't over, he said, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. No, Elena said, her eyes locked on his. It's just beginning. The sheriff stormed out of the room, leaving Warren behind. The lieutenant hesitated, then looked at Elena and Carter with something that resembled regret. This has gone too far, Warren said quietly. If you push, you'll find things you don't want to find. Elena stepped closer, her voice firm. Then maybe it's time someone uncovered them. Warren didn't respond. Instead, he turned and followed the sheriff out, leaving Elena and Carter alone. As they walked out of the precinct an hour later, Elena felt the weight of the confrontation settle over her. The fight wasn't over, but the cracks in Daniel's armor were starting to show. Whatever Warren had revealed, it had shaken him, and Elena was determined to find out what it was. Carter, she said as they reached her car. We need to dig deeper. Whatever Daniels is hiding, it's tied to Green, and if we can expose it, we can take the whole system down. Carter nodded, his expression serious. I'll make some calls, but you need to be ready for what comes next. Elena met his gaze, her resolve unwavering. I've been ready my whole life. As they drove away, the precinct loomed in the rearview mirror, its facade a reminder of the fight ahead. Elena tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her mind racing with the possibilities. Whatever the next move was, she wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was her determination. The sterile air of the town hall courtroom was heavy with tension. The rows of wooden benches were filled with townsfolk, reporters, and a smattering of Elena's supporters. At the front, Sheriff Daniels sat with a forced expression of calm, his posture rigid, while his lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. His face, however, betrayed a flicker of irritation and unease. Elena stood tall on the opposite side of the room. Her navy blazer was crisp, her composure sharp, and her determination unmistakable. Beside her, Carter shuffled through papers at the table, his demeanor confident and unbothered. He leaned toward Elena, his voice low. This is it, Carter said, his tone even. Everything comes down to this moment, stay sharp. Elena nodded but didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her focus was absolute. The hearing had been called in response to a growing outcry after her arrest. Elena's supporters, buoyed by Carter's swift maneuvering and the damning press coverage, had forced the town council to investigate Sheriff Daniels' conduct. It wasn't a criminal trial, not yet, but it was a public forum where the truth would either begin to unravel or tighten the system's grip. The council chair, an older woman named Marjorie Clayton, banged her gavel, silencing the murmurs that rippled through the room. Her eyes darted between Daniels and Elena before settling on the sheriff. Sheriff Daniels, she began, her voice measured. You stand accused of abusing your authority and obstructing the Grayson Outreach Program's efforts to provide medical care in this community. You will have an opportunity to respond to these allegations, but first, we will hear from Dr. Grayson. Elena stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. "Thank you, Chairwoman Clayton," Elena began, her voice steady. "For the past several weeks, my team and I have worked tirelessly to bring vital medical services to this community. We've faced challenges in the past, logistical delays, bureaucratic hurdles, but nothing like what we've encountered here in Silver Ridge." Her gaze swept the room, pausing on the reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads and the locals who watched with wide, uncertain eyes. She wanted them to feel the weight of her words. "From the moment we arrived, Sheriff Daniels and his department have done everything in their power to undermine our efforts. They've detained our equipment, harassed our staff, and, most recently, arrested me under false pretenses, all in an attempt to exert control over this town and the people who live here." The murmurs returned. Louder this time, Daniel's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection. This is conjecture." Clayton raised her hand, silencing him. "You'll have your chance to respond. Continue, Dr. Grayson." Elena nodded and pressed on. "This isn't about permits or regulations, it's about power, about a system that thrives on keeping people divided and underserved. But today, we're shining a light on that system, and we're demanding accountability." As she stepped back, the room buzzed with murmurs and whispers. Clayton turned to Daniels. "Sheriff, you may respond." Daniels stood slowly, his lawyer whispering something into his ear before he approached the stand. He looked out at the crowd, his face carefully composed. "Thank you, Chairwoman," Daniels began, his voice smooth. "Dr. Grayson is an impressive woman, wealthy, educated, and well-connected, but she's also a stranger to this town. She doesn't understand the challenges we face here, the delicate balance we maintain." He turned to face Elena, his tone sharpening. "What she calls obstruction, I call vigilance. My job is to protect this community, and I'll do whatever it takes to ensure its safety." Elena held his gaze, her expression unflinching. Daniels was playing to the room, casting himself as the protector of a fragile town under siege. But she knew his mask wouldn't hold for long. Carter stood next, his movements deliberate as he approached the podium. "Sheriff Daniels," he began, "you claim that your actions were motivated by a desire to protect this community. Is that correct?" "That's right," Daniels replied. Carter nodded, as though considering his words carefully. "And yet, your department detained medical equipment that was legally permitted, delayed critical care for dozens of patients, and arrested my client without probable cause. Tell me, Sheriff, how do those actions protect anyone?" Daniels' face darkened. "We followed protocol. If there were delays, that's unfortunate, but it wasn't malicious." Carter smiled faintly, the kind of smile that set opponents on edge. "Not malicious? Then how do you explain this?" He held up a folder and walked toward the council's table, handing copies of its contents to the members. Elena recognized the documents. They were the results of their investigation into Daniel's conduct, including sworn statements from whistleblowers and damning financial records. "These documents," Carter continued, his voice sharp, "show a pattern of misconduct in Sheriff Daniels' department, including falsified reports, misappropriation of funds, and multiple complaints of excessive force, all of which were swept under the rug. And Chairwoman, you'll note that many of these complaints were made by black residents of Silver Ridge." A stunned silence fell over the room. Daniel's lawyer jumped to his feet again, his voice rising. "This is irrelevant." "It's entirely relevant," Carter shot back, his voice like a whip. "It shows a pattern of systemic abuse that culminated in the sheriff's efforts to silence Dr. Grayson and her team." The tension in the room was electric as Clayton studied the documents. Her face betrayed no emotion, but her grip on the gavel tightened. She turned to Daniels, her voice steely. "Sheriff, do you have anything to say about these allegations?" Daniels' composure cracked. "This is a smear campaign. These outsiders don't understand how things work here. They're trying to tear this town apart." Carter stepped forward again. "No one is tearing anything apart, Sheriff. The only thing happening here is the truth coming to light." In the back of the room, a figure stood slowly. Elena recognized him as one of the deputies who had been at the clinic during her arrest. His face was pale, his movements hesitant, but he cleared his throat and spoke, his voice shaking. "Sheriff Daniels ordered us to hold the equipment," the deputy said, his words halting but clear. He said it didn't matter if it was legal, he just didn't want them here. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Daniels spun toward the deputy, his face livid. "Sit down," he barked. "You don't know what you're talking about." But it was too late. The room had turned. More murmurs rose, louder now, filled with disbelief and outrage. Daniels' lawyer grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, but the sheriff yanked it away, his mask slipping entirely. "This is my town!" Daniels roared, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "You don't get to come in here and tell me how to run things!" The outburst hung in the air, a damning revelation that laid bare his prejudice and corruption. Elena felt a chill run through her as the weight of his words sank in. Chairwoman Clayton banged her gavel, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Enough!" The room fell silent. She turned to Daniels, her expression grim. "Sheriff, you have disgraced your office and this community. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties pending further investigation." The room erupted in a mixture of cheers and shouts as reporters scrambled to capture the moment Daniels stood frozen, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He turned to Elena, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't over," he said. Elena met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "No, it isn't." As Daniels was escorted out, Elena allowed herself a moment to breathe. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt the tide beginning to turn. Carter placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression one of quiet pride. "You did it," he said. "No," Elena replied, her gaze sweeping the room. "We did it." But even as the crowd celebrated, Elena knew this was just the beginning. The system that had protected Daniels was still intact, and there were many more battles to fight. As she stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, she resolved to see this through to the end, no matter what it took. The courtroom buzzed with energy as Sheriff Daniels was escorted out in handcuffs, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. His lawyer trailed behind, frantically making calls on his phone, but it was clear the tide had turned. The documents Carter presented, combined with the deputy's testimony, had stripped Daniels of his last vestige of control. Elena sat at the table, her shoulders finally relaxing as the room began to clear. She glanced at Carter, who was busy fielding questions from a small group of reporters. His calm authority reassured her that they had made the right moves, but the adrenaline still coursed through her veins. This was a victory, but it didn't feel like the end, only the beginning of something bigger. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Word of Daniel's disgrace had spread, and people from all walks of life stood together, a mix of cautious optimism and righteous anger. Some carried homemade signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Accountability now." Others simply stood silently, their presence a statement of solidarity. Elena stepped out onto the courthouse steps, greeted by a cheer that sent a wave of warmth through her. Dr. Kim was among the crowd, his face lit with a rare smile. He stepped forward and extended his hand. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Elena clasped his hand firmly, feeling the strength of the community behind her. "This isn't just about Daniels," she said. "It's about changing the system that allowed him to thrive." Kim nodded. "And we'll keep fighting. You've shown us what's possible." The days following Daniels' removal were a whirlwind. The state attorney general announced a formal investigation into the Silver Ridge Sheriff's Department, citing years of buried complaints and ignored misconduct. Daniels' financial records revealed deep ties to local developers who had been using his position to intimidate residents into selling their land. The scandal unraveled quickly, implicating several deputies and even members of the town council. Elena watched the news coverage from her motel room, her emotions a mix of satisfaction and sorrow. The victory was undeniable, but it came with the sobering realization of just how deep the rot ran. Still, the community's response gave her hope. Local leaders were stepping up, demanding transparency and accountability in a way that hadn't been seen in decades. Late one evening, Elena returned to the clinic, now bustling with activity. The delays and obstacles seemed like a distant memory as patients streamed in, receiving the care they had long been denied. The sight filled her with a quiet pride, but also a sense of purpose that burned brighter than ever. Carter found her sitting in one of the exam rooms, reviewing charts. He leaned against the doorframe, his suit slightly rumpled after another day of meetings and interviews. "Still working?" he asked, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Elena looked up and smiled. "There's always more to do." He stepped inside and handed her a folder. "Speaking of which, the state investigators are asking for your input on systemic reforms. They're looking at overhauling the oversight process for rural law enforcement." Elena took the folder, her brow furrowing as she flipped through its contents. "It's a good start," she said. "But it needs to go further. Real accountability means empowering communities, not just moving pieces around." Carter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And I'm guessing you already have a plan." Elena set the folder down, her gaze steady. "I've learned that change doesn't happen overnight, but if we keep pushing, if we keep showing people what's possible, we can build something better." The fallout from Daniel's downfall rippled far beyond Silver Ridge. The state launched a broader initiative to review rural law enforcement practices, and communities across the region began organizing for their own reforms. Elena's outreach program became a model for collaboration between healthcare providers and underserved communities. Drawing national attention, in Silver Ridge, the changes were slow, but visible. A new interim sheriff was appointed, an outsider with a reputation for integrity. The department underwent mandatory training, and a citizen oversight board was established to ensure transparency. It was far from perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. Elena became a frequent visitor to the town, not just for the clinic, but for community forums and strategy meetings. She saw faces she recognized, people who had once been wary of her, but now greeted her with warmth and gratitude. The barriers of mistrust were beginning to crumble, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of unity. For Elena, the journey had been transformative. The experience had forced her to confront her own limits, not just as a doctor, but as a leader. She had always believed in the power of systems to create change, but now she understood the importance of grassroots movements and individual courage. She also learned the value of allies Carter's unwavering support, Kim's quiet resilience, and the bravery of the deputy who spoke out. These were the pieces that had made their victory possible. Elena realized that no matter how strong or capable she was, real change required collective effort. But not everything was resolved. Daniel's supporters, though silenced for now, still harbored resentment. Anonymous threats occasionally appeared in Elena's inbox, and her clinic staff remained vigilant. She knew that progress often came with backlash, but she refused to let it deter her. During a quiet moment at the clinic, she spoke with Kim about the next steps. "There's still so much to do," she said, her voice tinged with both determination and exhaustion. Kim placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And we'll do it together." As the sun set over Silver Ridge, Elena stood on the steps of the clinic, gazing out at the town. The streets were quiet now, but they hummed with the possibility of change. She thought of the people who had stood with her, the patients, the staff, the community members who had refused to stay silent. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past weeks lift slightly. The fight wasn't over, but it was no longer hers alone. Silver Ridge had found its voice, and so had she. Elena turned back to the clinic, the warm light spilling from its windows, a beacon in the night. She had come here to bring care, but she was leaving with something greater. A renewed sense of purpose, and a belief that even the most broken systems could be rebuilt, one step at a time. The air in Silver Ridge felt different now. It wasn't a sudden transformation. The streets were still lined with shuttered storefronts, and the town's challenges weren't solved overnight. But there was something new, something palpable, a sense of possibility. The quiet determination in the eyes of the townspeople told Elena that the seeds of change had been planted, and she knew from experience that even the smallest seeds could grow into something extraordinary with enough care. For Dr. Elena Grayson, the journey to this moment had been as transformative as it had been exhausting. When she first arrived in Silver Ridge, she had seen her outreach program as a mission of compassion and expertise, a way to extend care to those who had been forgotten. But as the weeks unfolded, she realized that her fight was about more than medicine. It was about justice, about giving voice to the silenced, and about standing firm in the face of systems designed to crush dissent. Elena had always prided herself on her resilience, her ability to rise above the challenges that came with being a trailblazer in her field. As a black woman in medicine, she was no stranger to the intersection of prejudice and power. But what she faced in Silver Ridge forced her to confront a deeper truth. Change required more than expertise and determination. It required vulnerability, collaboration, and the courage to embrace conflict. The events with Sheriff Daniels had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had walked into the town, confident in her ability to fix things, armed with her credentials and a belief in her mission. But she quickly learned that systems of oppression couldn't be dismantled by logic alone. They thrived on fear and division, and combating them meant building bridges with the very people she hoped to help. Elena's growth wasn't just about strategy, it was about trust. She had learned to rely on allies like Carter, who brought a fierce legal acumen to the fight, and Dr. Kim, whose quiet dedication steadied her in moments of doubt. She had seen the power of collective action in the courage of the deputy who spoke out, in the patients who stood beside her, and in the community members who demanded accountability. Silver Ridge wasn't unique in its struggles. The story of Sheriff Daniels and his unchecked authority was one of countless examples of systemic problems deeply rooted in history and perpetuated by complacency. Racism, abuse of power, and the silencing of marginalized voices weren't just problems of one town, they were the scaffolding of a broader system that prioritized control over compassion. The fall of Daniels revealed the rot beneath the surface, but it also highlighted the strength of the people who refused to let that rot define them. The investigation into the sheriff's department exposed a web of corruption, but it also sparked a broader conversation about oversight and accountability. The citizens of Silver Ridge, once resigned to the status quo, were now galvanized, organizing town halls and pushing for reforms that had once seemed impossible. Elena saw her experience as a microcosm of a larger struggle. She had fought for the right to provide care, but in doing so, she had uncovered the deeper injustices that made such care necessary. The events in Silver Ridge served as a reminder that healthcare, like justice, wasn't just about individual actions. It was about the systems that supported or undermined those actions. Elena's fight wasn't over. If anything, the victory in Silver Ridge had only deepened her resolve. The outpouring of support from activists, colleagues, and everyday people across the country reaffirmed her belief that change was possible, but it also reminded her of the work that remained. For every town like Silver Ridge, there were countless others where similar struggles played out in silence. She decided to expand her outreach program, not just in scope, but in purpose. It would no longer be solely about bringing medical care to underserved areas. It would be about empowering communities to advocate for themselves, to demand the resources and respect they deserved. She began forming partnerships with civil rights organizations and grassroots leaders, ensuring that her work addressed the systemic barriers that often made healthcare inaccessible. Elena also took steps to support the people of Silver Ridge beyond the clinic. She collaborated with local leaders to create educational programs, job training initiatives, and mental health resources. The goal wasn't just to heal the body, it was to heal the community. Change, Elena knew, wasn't linear. There would be setbacks and resistance, as there always were when entrenched power structures were challenged. Even in Silver Ridge, not everyone was ready to embrace the new sheriff or the reforms being implemented. Some still clung to Daniel's rhetoric, blaming Elena for disrupting their version of order. But Elena also knew that progress wasn't about erasing opposition. It was about persistence. It was about showing up, day after day, even when the path ahead seemed impossible. She saw that spirit in the faces of her staff, her patients, and the townspeople who had risked so much to stand with her. One evening, as she stood outside the clinic, watching the sun dip below the horizon, a young girl approached her. She was one of the patients Elena had treated during her first week in town, a shy teenager whose migraines had kept her out of school. "Dr. Grayson," the girl said, her voice hesitant but steady, "thank you for everything you've done. You made me feel like I mattered." Elena knelt to meet the girl's eyes, her heart swelling with both pride and humility. "You do matter," she said, "and don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." The girl nodded, her smile small but genuine, before running off to join her friends. Elena watched her go, the moment crystallizing in her mind as a reminder of why she fought. Elena's story wasn't unique, It was a reflection of the countless battles being waged every day by people who refused to accept the world as it was. Her journey in Silver Ridge was a testament to the power of resilience, of community, and of speaking truth to power. It was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change was possible. To the audience, whether they were reading her story, hearing about it on the news, or living similar struggles, Elena hoped her experience would serve as inspiration. She wanted them to see that one person's courage could ignite a movement, that collective action could dismantle even the most entrenched systems, and that every step forward, no matter how small, was worth taking. Her message was simple. The fight for justice, equality, and compassion wasn't an obligation. It was an opportunity to make the world better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. As Elena packed up her belongings to leave Silver Ridge, she felt a mix of emotions. The town had changed her as much as she had changed it. The scars of the battle would remain, but so would the bonds she had forged and the lessons she had learned. Driving out of town, she glanced in the rearview mirror at the clinic's glowing sign, a beacon of hope in the gathering dusk. She smiled, knowing that the work would continue, not just in Silver Ridge, but in every place where people demanded better. Her journey wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. And as she drove toward the horizon, the road ahead seemed brighter than ever. Elena's story is a reminder that progress is born from struggle, that resilience can overcome even the most daunting challenges, and that true change begins with a single step. Whether in a small town like Silver Ridge, or on a global stage, the fight for justice is one we must all take up together.